Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and we are back checking out Arch's Death Korps of Krieg. We're going to be checking out a lot of the senior ranks, the officers, the NCOs, and something called a Watchmaster. This is going to be wild because it's the Death Korps, so let's get into it. And of course, number one way to support the channel is the merch store. Check out the link below. I've got lots of new shirts, added some new designs. They look pretty cool. So if you want to support the channel, be sure to pick up some stuff. All right, let's get into it.
And as for privilege, well, it doesn't have much in the way of privileges. It is not a promotion. You retain the same rank as you did in the regular Death Korps, but, well, you get a fancy helmet, which is going to end up getting you killed, granted, but hey, details. And if you should be so incredibly fucking lucky as to actually survive, that makes you eligible for Watchmaster training. And Watchmaster is the first official rank one must achieve on the long and extraordinarily thorny road towards that fancy-ass officer's helmet, and is de facto a non-commissioned officer, the rough equivalent of a sergeant in other Imperial Guard regiments. As you probably gathered by now, when a Death Korps regiment is raised, all of its officers, including its NCOs, are brought in from other formations that have, in all due likelihood, been wiped the fuck out.
So what's interesting is actually the model of replacements in different wars, at least in the U.S. history, has been a constant source of controversy. In the Second World War, the rotation policy was that wounded soldiers would be sent back to recuperate in a central depot, and then they would be assigned to another unit that needed their type of soldier. So, for example, let's say a mechanic or a tank operator would be, let's say they got an intestinal parasite and they needed to recuperate for 3 weeks in a hospital. They would be sent back to the rear lines, and they would recuperate for however long they needed, and once they were deemed fit for duty, they would be simply assigned to a central holding depot, and would then be assigned to a new regiment, a new battalion that had an opening for a tank driver. The problem with this system is, of course, that you're taking experienced soldiers, but experienced soldiers who were part of a really closely knit team. Imagine being with a tank crew for 2 years, getting, a fairly minor recoverable ailment, and then never seeing that tank crew again. Not seeing your old CO, not your old squad leader, no one. Instead, you go to a brand new regiment with a brand new way of doing things and a tank crew that not only doesn't know or trust you, but is still grieving the person who previously held the position, because obviously there was an opening for a reason. So that was seen as a disaster. In fact, there were stories of soldiers actually going AWOL in an effort to return to their original unit. So they would be assigned to one part of the front and would dip on that unit and go to another part of the front to join their battle buddies. Seems kind of weird that you would have a system that would be so bad that soldiers themselves would actually start to reassign themselves to different combat units, not to avoid duty, but to perform duty with people they liked better. In Vietnam, the system was somehow even worse. That system was an individual personnel rotation system. And so what you would have is this unit would be stationed in Vietnam indefinitely. They'd say, okay, the 173rd Airborne Unit there, headquartered in Vietnam. But what would rotate through are individuals on 12-month tours or 6-month tours for officers. And this, of course, had this really bizarre effect where everyone was sort of in different phases of their tour. So you would have these old hats who were, 10 months into their tour when you arrived, and they would be very close with everyone else who'd been there, I'm going to say over 6 months, whereas the new soldier would arrive and he would be distrusted, regarded with suspicion, and regarded as having not proved himself and not really being one of the guys. the irony, of course, is that 10-month-old soldier, right? When he arrived, was in the same boat. He was the new guy. No one trusted him. No one knew who he was. But one by one, the more senior folks above him rotated out, and then he was the senior person. Of course, this was even more frequent with officers, where they would serve in a position for 6 months and then rotate out. So almost every enlisted soldier would serve under 2 officers. And this was a huge problem because officers would be good. Even the best officers would need time to get caught up. And by the time they figured out the way things worked, they would be 3 months into their tour. And then you would get 3 months of good officership, decent leadership. And by the time that officer was really hitting their stride, they would be rotated out and replaced with another green officer. So the system was just pretty bad. It was really demoralizing for new troops who were the ones in most need of training, mentorship, and assistance. It was bad for old troops who, of course, would feel like they were disconnected from all of their old colleagues, and it just wasn't good for the officers who never really got to accrue enough experience to be really effective combat leaders. Finally, in conflicts like the Persian Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan, there was a unit-based rotation system generally. And this would involve units of 200 or 300 people up to a battalion or brigade rotating through the war theater at once. You would have a 1-year rotation of headquarters. You would have a 1-year rotation of all subordinate units. And generally, these would sort of align. So this, of course, in some ways was really, really great for soldier morale, but there were trade-offs. And one of the trade-offs was that when you have the senior most leadership rotating out, then you lose strategic vision, right? Those new generals, those new senior leaders come in with a new vision, and they don't necessarily have the ability to look back and say, what has happened over the past 6 years in theater, 5 years in theater, and how do I continue that? Or how do I avoid making the same mistakes? Instead, they arrive with cold information and really are looking to do things their way. Of course, that results in 21-year wars instead of a single 20-year effort sustained over time. This also has the effect of soldiers that may be less invested in winning individually. Again, in World War II, soldiers went home when Nazi Germany was defeated. Ooh, I said, I'm going to have to edit that out. When the German forces were defeated. Therefore, but, you get there's a little bit more of a focus on going home, like you saw in Vietnam, right? It wasn't about beating the North Vietnamese. It was just about going home. And when you're fighting an insurgency that is fighting in their home, they're already home. So you can't really outlast them, right? It's just not feasible. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the biggest trade-offs is, of course, the lack of strategic vision and the lack of gaining a lot of experience. It's also really hard because you basically take an entire year of combat experience and you wipe it out and replace it with green soldiers. They used to say that the most dangerous time of a deployment is the first 100 days in theater because that's when a unit gets a real deep sense of the actual threats on the ground, how to cope with them, what they're going to do, etc., etc.
Or, if by some utter goddamn miracle, have actually had too many officers, which, considering the casualty rates, is pretty rare. Nevertheless, any Death Korps formation would not be complete without its NCOs, as these are the men responsible both for training the raw recruits and instilling in them the proper sense of responsibility that the battlefield requires. After all, they've had it easy up until now. The Watchmasters also double as squad leaders. In your average Death Korps of Krieg regiments, you would have 82 Watchmasters, one for each individual infantry and or heavy weapon squad, one per platoon command squad, one veteran Watchmaster per company command squad, and finally, the role of Watchmaster for the regimental commander is taken by the regiment's commissar. Furthermore,
so that's interesting because that is also the role of U.S. Army NCOs. They are expected to be both the tactical leadership of their unit, but also the head trainers. They're expected to train up their unit to fight and function, obviously with a calendar and resources provided by their higher command.
Each Watchmaster has himself a personal little butt boy, a teacher's pet if you wish. This is his senior Guardsman aide. This is essentially his second in command, whether it be in the squad, in the platoon, or in the company command squad. He is also a person that the Watchmaster is essentially grooming for the role of Watchmaster. Natürlich, he still has to survive his period in the Grenadiers, but considering he's been under the personal tutelage of a Watchmaster, somebody who already made it through their Grenadier service, his chances of surviving are probably 3 in 10. Rather than 2 in 10.
I really doubt that getting a personal tutelage from a grenadier is going to increase your chance of survival by 50%. That seems ridiculous. From what we know of the Death Korps, they will not... Individual bravery is only a minor factor predicting your success. I think the vast majority of Death Korps units are sent on missions, from what it sounds like, where they're expected to just have a 90+% casualty rate in most cases, and if they do survive with their command structure intact, over mission after mission, they will end up just getting attrited down. So it doesn't really matter whether you are the top 10% of Grenadiers or the bottom 10%, you're just going to you're just going to end up on the wrong end of statistics, right? And this is the thing that sort of is uncomfortable for people, is this idea that it's like IEDs in Afghanistan and Iraq. They didn't care who was in the truck, whether they were the fattest, most incompetent soldier you've ever seen, or a fit, promising young, specialist. Didn't matter. The truck was the truck. Some days you were the lead truck, some days you were the middle truck, some days you were the front truck, depended on a whole bunch of circumstances. And it was just roll the dice. And that's the thing that people forget about war and combat, is that so much of it is luck. And even if you're a promising grenadier, there's almost no reason to have a promising young grenadier, because that grenadier will probably die. So given that reality, why you would invest anything in a walking corpse is preposterous.
Now, presuming that our hopeful little cadet has not only survived his grenadier service, but also made it through his period as a Watchmaster, he will reach the first commissioned officer rank of the Death Korps of Krieg, which, interestingly enough, is not a direct command position at all. Or, well, it is, kind of, but not in the way you might expect. The Quartermaster is an interesting amalgamation of battlefield medic, administratum clerk, and ecclesiarchy preacher. He's supposed to wander the battlefield during and after a battle and retrieve casualties. Although, well, to be fair, retrieving casualties is his secondary duty. His primary duty, as hinted at by the name Quartermaster, is to get their equipment back. After all, replacement personnel are a dime a dozen. Krieg spits those out by the millions every single year, but lasguns, power packs, bayonets, chainswords, rebreathers, boots, uniforms, these things can be damn hard to get a hold of, especially since all of those millions coming out of Krieg also require all of these things before they leave the planet. Now, of course, the Quartermaster isn't entirely heartless. He will aid soldiers that are wounded, with certain qualifications, shall we say. The role has its origin during the brutal Civil War, when resources were extraordinarily scarce, and in fact the most expendable resource for both sides was manpower. This meant that neither of the warring sides really wasted much in the way of resources on men that wouldn't fight again, and it was the Quartermaster's task to determine who deserved medical attention because they could be returned to the fight within a relatively reasonable time frame, and who had earned the Emperor's mercy, which is of course the term used to describe a battlefield execution. These days, the Quartermasters are a little bit more merciful. Not in that way, I mean as in actually saving them, because they have access to considerably larger resources and considerably more technology with which to return troops to the front line. But even then, it is the Quartermaster's job to put the needs of the regiment ahead of those of any single individual wounded soldier. This means that if the Quartermaster deems that the same amount of resources that would be spent on one severely wounded man could potentially save 2 others, he will not hesitate a single instant to put a lasbolt through the first man's head, pausing just long enough to deliver him the Emperor's benediction to make sure that his soul flies straight and true to the Emperor's side. Which, to be fair, it might. The Emperor is at this point pretty much a Chaos God. It's not entirely impossible that he's got himself a little part of the warp somewhere where these poor pitiful souls can rest. The alternative, well, let's not dwell too much on that, shall we?
Oh, man. Yeah, it's interesting. So I think of this as a little bit of a reference to the executive officer position. In most company-level leadership, the executive officer is actually the senior lieutenant who has usually completed their platoon leader time, but not always. And what they do is handle almost anything the commander doesn't want to do. And almost always this is logistics, training, personnel, support staff, ordering parts. It really can depend on a lot of things, but it's also covering down on whatever your commander doesn't find interesting. And so if you have a particularly weak commander, it's not uncommon to see those XOs really hold them up and kind of prop them up, feed them information they need to succeed. I wrote my unit's training calendar and would make a lot of decisions that I think generally were expected of a true commander. All my boss really had to do was attend the meetings. But that's a great way for a young officer to learn about all of the things that go on the back end to making the military succeed. And that, of course, is logistics. As we saw in Afghanistan, there was never really a shortage of there was a shortage of Afghans willing to fight, but the critical shortages were in capable, competent, and honest logistics officers and planners. And when you don't have those, it doesn't matter how capable and competent your fighting forces are. If, again, the Kriegsmen could be the bravest fighting force in the galaxy, but without lasguns, uniforms, and rebreathers, they will not be fighting much of anything.
Will make an already rather depressing episode even worse. And as for the command aspect, as mentioned, the Quartermaster is a commissioned officer, which means that he is officially commissioned to lead men into battle, unlike the Watchmaster, who is a non-commissioned officer. However, the Quartermaster, as mentioned, do not lead soldiers. Instead, they usually surround themselves with a gaggle of medical personnel and servitors, since of course Quartermasters are few and far between, and after a nice big battle of marching slowly into machine gun fire, there is more than enough for a Quartermaster to do, so much that he needs to delegate at least a little bit. Assuming that the person in question survives the Quartermaster role as well, which, by the way, is probably the safest of the ones so far, then he will finally become a proper officer, with a proper command and everything, and the usual rank structure will now reassert itself. There are, of course, another couple specialized roles within the Death Korps, however, beyond the usual Guardsman, these being a Death Korps Engineer and a Death Korps Rider. The Riders are not so much a specialized branch as they are a pseudo-elite within the Death Korps. They are cavalry that specialize in direct assault. Yep, that's right. Whilst most cavalry in 40k perform a harassing role, essentially meaning that they're motorized infantry without the motor part, that they will descend from their horses and fight on foot, the Death Riders, they utilize their hunting lances in the way they were always meant to do, in straight-up, massed cavalry charges. Now, this would be suicidal for pretty much any Rough Rider regiment, but the Death Riders are equipped with the Krieg steeds. This is a very, very heavily genetically modified version of the original Terran horse. Although at this point it's probably got more in common with a fucking grizzly bear than it does a horse. These things have been known to take several heavy bolter rounds to the chest, essentially pulping virtually all of its internal organs, and still keep going for another couple hundred meters. Despite all of this, the casualty rates amongst the Death Riders are actually relatively small when compared to the infantry. Of course, when they are actually in direct combat, they die like absolute fucking flies, at a rate that even the infantry would shake their heads at. But for the most part, they are deployed as light screening troops, as scouts, and as a rapid breakthrough force. They are not, generally speaking, hurled against entrenchment and bunker complexes. Due to this somewhat unusual nature, the members of the Death Riders are usually selected for two traits that in the infantry would be considered highly unfitting indeed, and that is independent thought and initiative, both of which are considered dirty, filthy curse words in the infantry. But due to their role as advanced scouts, breakthrough troops, and screening troops, the Death Riders have to be able to make independent decisions without waiting for their higher commanders to give them instructions.
Yeah, in a cult-like environment, independent thinking and independent decision-making is pretty toxic. And that is, of course, because if you select for someone and encourage them to question assumptions and attempts to infer what needs to be done when the directions are not clear, you're setting yourself up for a person to ask more fundamental questions, like why do we die in such high numbers when the Imperial Guard that does the exact same thing dies in much, much lower numbers? And why do we kill all these people who could be returned to the battlefield when the Imperium has almost infinite resources? Right? Those are the sort of questions that are so toxic because once you ask them, you cannot unsee it. You know, it's if you've ever had that happen where someone tells you some piece of information. Sometimes it's a person's goofy trait, right? Do you ever notice the way Paul keeps like swallowing really hard because he doesn't have enough to drink and he's talking the whole time, right? Once you see it, you can't unsee it, and it really annoys you. So when you have that, right, but that can also happen for organizations, you know, and I'll be honest, I'm kind of going through it right now, watching the U.S. military like withdraw from Afghanistan and seeing how like this very, very expensive, very well-trained, very experienced, very well-resourced organization was completely and totally unable to build any kind of meaningful Afghan armed forces. And it really makes you question your assumptions about the effectiveness of everything that the government tries to do. That said, right, once you see it, right, so what you can't have is even one soldier that starts to espouse those ideas to other soldiers because they spread like wildfire, especially if they offer them an insight into something that explains their own hardships. And that is a pretty dangerous prospect for any military. So it makes sense that you would want to keep these riders culturally isolated on their own, not really interacting with the frontline troops. And you would want to kill them en masse.
But this self-reliance is not entirely unique within the Death Korps, although relatively rare. There is one further branch of the Death Korps military that also needs to have the ability to make decisions on the fly, and that is the second and last specialization, Death Korps Engineers. If the officers are the brain, the Death Korps riders its eyes and ears, and the infantry its lifeblood, then the Death Korps engineers are the strong hands of the army. They are the ones that dig the fortifications. They are the ones that prepare the positions for artillery. They are the ones that dig the offensive saps, allowing the infantry to get closer to the enemy's position without having to wander unprotected through no man's land. And all of that is, of course, before we get to their true, main military purpose, that of digging massive fucking tunnels underneath the enemy's lines, either for offensive purposes, e.g. burrowing into the enemy's trenches and then unloading thousands upon thousands of guardsmen, or by depositing vast quantities of explosives and making sure that the enemy lines simply cease to exist.
So that actually happened in both the First World War, but also in the Civil War. There was, I want to say it was the Battle of like Fredericksburg or Vicksburg, where I think it was Confederate troops or Union troops actually dug a hole and planted a huge quantity of explosives directly underneath Confederate positions and then set them off. And then the plan was to actually flood into this hole they had made, which was incredibly stupid because it was a shooting gallery. And it was really poorly thought out, obviously. What they should have done was detonated the hole in the line and then charged the line, but that's neither here nor there, right? Or just infiltrated and emerged, right, from under the ground far behind their lines and had a small army suddenly materialize. That would have been even smarter. But, again, neither here nor there. But there is a long, long history of tunneling operations. Even the greatest military for tunneling operations was probably the North Vietnamese. They were masters of building tunnel fortifications. They would be almost perfectly concealed and nearly invisible, and they would house sometimes several rooms, up to even a dozen, where you would have planning, you would have medical care, you'd even have a cafeteria and a sleeping room, all within this tunnel network.
Unfortunately,
of course, it would also be guarded with a host of really innovative traps.
The enemy is very rarely particularly fond of this eventuality, and will do everything in their power to stop the engineers from completing their mission. This leads to a peculiar and extraordinarily nasty form of warfare, partially because the two sides are essentially blind. Even the most high-tech 41st millennium technology can only do so much to identify an enemy that is sitting behind literal tons and tons and tons of Earth. This means that
Okay, the modern military actually has really advanced seismic readers. They can feel out if people are tunneling under the ground pretty easily.
Every single swing of a pickaxe, every single move of a shovel could potentially collapse in on an enemy mine, which leads to a very quick, very vicious, brutal close-quarters encounter, where the two sides will be fighting each other in a literal trench, perhaps a couple meters wide and a couple meters tall at most, and frequently considerably less than that.
Yeah, the North Vietnamese tunnels would be like a person wide. It would be extremely small. You probably wouldn't even be able to stand in them. And that is very efficient, and it's also terrifying, and extremely terrifying to have to fight someone in those conditions.
And once an enemy mine has been broken into, all bets are off. The Death Korps engineers are given a huge quantity of specialized equipment to fulfill their variety of roles. Bolt cutters, auspexes, shotguns, long saw-blade bayonets, folding spades, melter chargers, mole launchers, frag grenades, crack grenades, carapace armor, specialized gas mask, etc., etc., etc. But perhaps one of their nastiest weapons are their gas hand grenades. These pump out a particularly vicious form of gas that is capable of even eating through gas masks if they are exposed to the gas for long enough periods of time. Now, of course, the Death Korps engineers are fully aware of this, and yet they will not hesitate a single second in deploying these weapons. Any and all actions taken underground are bound to be short, vicious, and extraordinarily bloody for all parts involved. And perhaps the worst thing is that it is far easier to collapse a mine than it is to build it. Which means that when a mine is discovered...
Sorry, it is really confusing for him to call them mines. They are not mines because they are not mining for anything. They are tunnels, right? A mine is what you would emplace in the ground to, say, disrupt a tunneling operation. So if you really want to be a dick, right, you would guess where the Death Korps was going to emerge or where logically they would want to tunnel through, which you actually can guess pretty well if you know the soil composition of different areas. And then you dig some deeply placed mines, right, like a mine wall basically under the ground, so that as the Death Korps dig in, they eventually bump into this mined area, set off the mines, and collapse their tunnel.
Discovered, the enemy is sitting on...
Of course, you would have to know that's what the Death Korps does to do that. And again, if you're fighting orcs or Tyranids, it may just not happen like that.
On all the cards as to how to deal with it. And even if the Death Korps engineers are capable of breaking into the enemy mine quickly enough and decisively enough to stop them from collapsing it, you can bet your happy little ass that they will definitely be collapsing the exit. This can, in most cases, lead to the Death Korps engineers losing days, weeks, possibly even months or years worth of work in mere minutes. It can be an extraordinarily trying form of warfare. Not only are you under constant stress due to the fact that at any moment all hell can break loose, you also have to deal with the fact that rather frequently all of your hard work is going to be for absolutely nothing. It's the kind of warfare that is quite likely to break a man, but fortunately, the men of Krieg have seen worse, and will continue to see worse for as long as they are serving within the Death Korps. If anything, this really is the form of warfare that suits their demeanor the absolute best. And finally, of course, we come to the humble Krieg Guardsman. There's nothing particularly special about him, except for the fact that he is probably the toughest fighting man in the entire galaxy. Of course, except for the post-human variant. He's also...
Okay, that's a fair point. He is the toughest fighting man in the whole galaxy, which puts him below almost every orc, almost every Tyranid, almost every Necron, almost every Eldar. Yeah, and of course every post-human space marine. Every post-human fighter, period.
Also equipped in a rather fascinating way. On one hand, he has a very high-tech and very powerful respirator unit, along with a fully chemically and biologically sealed uniform. Their boots, their gloves, their greatcoats, their helmets, their respirators, absolutely everything is worked with special chemicals. And the Guardsmen are constantly resupplied with fresh pots of this chemical to rub into their clothing, making sure that it remains proof against practically anything and everything the enemy can throw at them. Once fully dressed up, a Death Korps Guardsman is essentially invulnerable to any and all forms of bacteriological or gas-based warfare, with a few exceptions, the Life Eater virus, of course, being one of them.
The Tyranids. And I took that personally.
This near-total immunity allows the Death Korps to deliver large-scale gas attacks to the enemy, while still allowing their infantry to advance practically unscathed. And whilst this would be an extremely traumatizing and claustrophobic form of warfare for pretty much anybody, just imagine wandering through a battlefield. Bullets are whizzing all around you, your helmet is deafening the sound, your gas mask worked in with all kinds of chemicals stinks to high heaven, and your sweat causes it to stick to your face in a very uncomfortable manner.
Well, here's the thing. If you can get used to anything, and if it's like wearing a seatbelt, right? You wear a seatbelt long enough, and you feel naked in your car when your car's moving without it, right? But like when they first introduced seatbelts, people were like, they're uncomfortable. They constrict me. If I get in a car accident, what if it traps me in the car, right? There's all that dumb shit that basically is versions of it's uncomfortable and it's new and I don't like the feeling of this new thing, right? And so if you grew up wearing that, then you might just view it as being comfortable and you might feel naked without it. right? I mean, the body armor is not comfortable, but I would feel naked if I was on patrol and didn't have it on.
You can barely see anything, and what you can see is constant boiling clouds of gas, and you are painfully aware that a single rift in your uniform will leave you dangerously exposed to said gas. This is the kind of situation that a lot of people would probably start panicking, but for a Death Korps Guardsman, this is normal. They are, after all, trained to wear their gas masks at pretty much any and all times during the day. Every single one of them has undergone dozens, if not hundreds of hours in training in artificial gas chambers, and in all due likelihood, considering the severity of Krieg training, they've probably been bombarded by gas weapons on more than one occasion whilst training, quote-unquote. For them, attacking during a heavy artillery and gas barrage would be absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. But for all of the advanced nature of their uniforms, they do carry a surprisingly archaic primary weapon. Their main weapon is the Lucius Pattern No. 98 lasgun. This is a variant on the standard issue lasgun primarily produced on Krieg, and it has a fair few little quirks that makes it quite different from the standard issue lasgun. The most noteworthy and obvious is probably the fact that it is a single-shot weapon only. It has no other firing modes, no overcharge mode, no burst fire, and no automatic fire. Every time you pull the trigger, the weapon is going to do the exact same thing one time, and one time only.
Okay, that is not the description of a single-shot weapon. A single-shot weapon would be one in which you fire once and then have to change the power pack. If you describe a rifle as single shot, what most people will assume you mean is that the weapon is capable of firing a single shot before necessitating a full reload. There are a handful of very low-cost hunting rifles, I think either low-cost or ultra-high-end hunting rifles, that are single shot. But the vast majority, right, are what are called bolt action, and that means you can pull the trigger once, but then to load the next round to the magazine, you cycle a bolt, and you cycle around with the bolt. That cycling process draws a round up from the magazine and chambers it, readying you for your next shot. That is a World War I style rifle, and World War II, depending on your military. The weapon, what he is describing, where you pull the trigger, a shot fires, you pull the trigger again, a shot fires, that is semi-automatic, which means you don't have to cycle a bolt between shots, but that the pulling of the first trigger sets you up for the next round to pull the trigger the next time. A semi-automatic, right? A semi-automatic would be like a pistol, right? The M14 is a semi-automatic rifle, right? Then you have things like 3-round burst fire, or selective fire, as it sometimes is called, and those, selective fire, and that would be a fire mode that's like a 3-round burst, a 2-round burst, a 5-round burst, right? And then you have fully automatic, which is you depress the trigger and the weapon fires until running out of ammo. So he is not describing a single-shot rifle, he's describing a semi-automatic rifle.
In return, however, the weapon...
Or a semi-automatic lasgun, right? A rifle needs to have rifling in the barrels to give the bullet a spin. If there's no bullets and there's no rifling, then it's not a rifle, it's just a lasgun.
Is considerably more powerful than your standard issue lasgun, round about 12 to 15% more oomph per lasbolt. This does, however, also come at the cost of rate of fire, with the number 98 firing considerably slower than the standard issue lasgun. And finally, to really hammer home the point, due to the increased power of the weapon and the fact that it uses a standard las pack, it only has 25 rounds per power pack magazine. The Lucius Pattern No. 98 lasgun is a precision weapon. It's got the sheer force to put practically anything on its ass, but it requires a cool...
Also, not true. It would, mildly irritate an orc. Perhaps merely give a Tyranid a sensation of tingling. and would probably not even register to something like a Chaos Space Marine.
Cool head and a steady pair of hands to get the most out of it. This is definitively not a weapon for those easily frightened. And finally, of course, every Krieg Guardsman's favourite possession, their combat bayonet. A 45cm long sword bayonet made out of specially treated razor-sharp plasteel. The Death Korps of Krieg's elan and bravura on the charge is well known throughout the Imperium, and along with their VAT-birthed technology, they are also granted the standard template construct for a special form of combat knives. This STC technology creates knives that are lighter, sharper, and easier to maintain than pretty much any other bladed weapon in the Imperium, and it is more than capable of making a complete and utter mockery out of practically any form of standard issue body armor. And speaking of armor, the Death Korps doesn't get any, except for their greatcoat, which will provide some form of limited ballistic protection, but not much. It might be enough to save a Death Korps Guardsman from a hit by a ballistic or las weapon at the extreme end of its effective range, but you probably don't want to bet on it. Of course, there is also a pair of shoulder guards, but, oh well. I suppose that if you are so lucky as to get shot only in the shoulder, then God Emperor knows, I suppose. They might save you.
I love that. You only get an issue of, I'm gonna say 6 inches by 6 inches of protective plate. And what do you choose to protect? You protect the shoulders, right? If you have 6 inches by 6 inches, I mean, you're gonna want to put it squarely over your heart and chest, right? This is like the center mass. That is where most people will aim for. This is the hardest to heal part of you. It's got the heart and the lungs. You put it here and you put it here, right? Everything, and again, this is why you see modern plate carriers basically just cover this part of the upper torso, because that is the 0 chance of recovery wounding spot.
But their primary purpose is simply to have the regimental number along with the individual infantry number placed upon them, basically so that the quartermasters can have an easier time checking off the casualty lists. As for non-combat related items, the Death Korps of Krieg Guardsman will carry with him 2 different maintenance kits, one for his number 98 lasgun, which due to the sheer amount of heat it produces can be a somewhat temperamental weapon, and one for his respirator, which is probably hands down the most complicated piece of kit he possesses. These are both carried in a standard issue leather backpack. In addition to this, he also has a bedroll, which doubles as a waterproof half shelter.
That is funny, because that is exactly what they had in World War I. They would use, and further back, they actually call it a cowboy bedroll, where you have a oiled waterproof sheet, of like oilcloth, but nowadays we'd probably refer to it as like a tarp. And then you have a wool blanket, and you roll the two up together. And what you can actually do is lay one on top of the other and then fold them together to form a little sandwich. And if your tarp has little like slits or grommets in it, you can actually weave some string, like shoestring or cord, through it to create a little pocket sleeping bag. And it's great because it's waterproof, it's got a little bit of insulation on the inside, and if it's already kind of warm out, you have something a little bit warmer to help you sustain yourself through the night. In addition to when you're in any rainy environment, the ability to prop up a small waterproof shelter will enable you to work and keep a small place and some of your things dry, which is also super essential.
And a series of dry tin canisters. These are quite special in that they are isolated from the outside environment, which means that they can keep food and other perishable items fresh and edible even in the most hostile of climates. And, of course, considering their love for siege warfare, they carry a series of entrenching tools. Usually this is a foldable spade, but in the case of heavier entrenchment works, they will be issued with pickaxes and larger shovels. As for ammunition, the standard loadout is 4 lasgun power packs, along with a single frag grenade and a single crack grenade. Additionally, each member, with the exception of the sergeant and the senior guardsman, is expected to carry one form or another of ammunition for the squad's specialist gunner. This could be hydrogen flask for a plasma gun, additionally promethium for a flamer, grenades for a grenade launcher, or energy packs for a melter gun. Now, in reality, this loadout is a little bit light, since it would give the average guardsman about 125 rounds of ammunition for his lasgun, which probably is nowhere even remotely close to enough for an extended engagement. And whilst most guardsmen understand rather quickly that the art of scavenging ammunition is probably the most important art a guardsman could ever learn, on Krieg, they follow the rules. And the rule says you bring 4 packs, 1 frag grenade, and 1 crack grenade. But luckily, their officers all come from the ranks that have previously gone through the exact same shit that they are going to have to go through now. And they realize that these rules are perhaps a little bit too strict. As such, whenever a formation is expected to enter into combat, their standard issue loadout is usually bumped up quite considerably.
So here is the thing that's interesting. That is actually in terms of weight, not that far off from a standard World War I loadout. An entrenching tool, an oilcloth, a wool blanket, your rifle, and about 100 rounds, or 125 rounds, plus a grenade and a small bread sack for perishables and other personal items. These, of course, in the First World War would also include things like probably a small sewing kit, and a shaving kit, perhaps, and a small mess tin. But the reason you want to keep it light is because lightly packed soldiers move quickly, and they can march rapidly. And the U.S. Army, of course, has expanded and expanded and expanded the standard soldier's combat loadout to now be, once again, around 100 pounds. Which means you're slowed down considerably, but in the era of mechanized warfare, the trade-offs aren't quite the same. Classically, in World War I, you would see infantry soldiers march upwards of 25 to 40 miles in a day, and then would be expected to fight at the end of that march. And it was completely exhausting for them, right? And a extreme logistical challenge because, again, when you carry very little on your person, then you depend on supply trains to keep you equipped.
And then the final piece of kit issued to every single Krieg Guardsman is their shoulder pads. These are used to identify which platoon, which squad, and which regiment the Guardsman is from, as well as identifying him to others as he receives his final piece of equipment, quote-unquote, that being his new name. In the Death Korps, you don't go by your old name. In fact, you don't go by a proper name at all. You are simply issued a serial code and/or a number. This goes true even for higher officers, and it might be reissued upon gaining a higher rank. For example, the commander of an entire regiment might simply be known as Alpha 1. This is partially done as a simple expedience because, well, Death Korps regiments are used to rather high casualty figures, and as such, being able to keep the list nice and easy and tidy is very valuable, and of course, it has symbolic value. Once a man joins the Death Korps and receives his number, he is, for all intents and purposes, already dead. All that remains now is for him to commit to and complete his final sacrifice. Then his name will be crossed off a list and he can go and sit by the Emperor's side, his sacrifice and duty finally complete. And with that, as the Guardsman's life officially ends and he begins his period of sacrifice, we'll wrap up this video on the Death Korps of Krieg, the starting video on the Siege of Vrax series. I hope you've enjoyed this entry, and I hope you'll stick with me for the rest of the Siege of Vrax.
All right. Yeah. Wow. That was a really interesting look at their officer structure. It really is modeled after World War I quite a bit. It is fascinating to talk about the serial number. That is really common in almost all militaries. When I was deployed, it was the first letter of your last name and the last 4 of your social. That was generally your identification number. but that, of course, has changed over time. Again, it's easy because it's a function of the fact that it just needs to be a unique alphanumeric. Whereas, like, there must be 100 people with 1,000 people with the last name Johnson. I wasn't even the only, Paul last name on global, right? You could find someone with my exact name elsewhere on the DoD global network. So obviously, it's way, way simpler to just have a designated alphanumeric. That said, guys, thank you so much for watching. This has been another awesome video. Gotta say, Arch definitely goes deep into detail, and if you love military history and deep, deep dives, Arch is definitely your guy. So thank you so much for sticking around. Hope you guys learned something, and be sure, again, to check out the merch store, right? #1 way to support the channel. Check out the second channel dedicated to Team Fortress 2 and whatever else strikes my fancy. And yeah, until next time, I will see you guys later.